By my reckoning, lads, we shall call him Uncle Sam.
Aye, a finer name there never was.
The Arizona Territory in the late 19th century was a landscape of harsh binaries, blinding sunlight and freezing nights, vast silence and sudden violence, the known world of the settlement and the unknown terror of the chaparral. In the spring of 1883, near the isolated outpost of Eagle Creek, these binaries collapsed into a singular, horrific event that would birth a legend known as the Red Ghost. The morning began with the mundane rhythms of frontier life. Two women, whose names have been obscured by the passage of time but whose terror remains vividly archived in the Mojave County Miner, were alone in their adobe homestead. Their husbands were miles away, inspecting sheep flocks in a region still tense with the threat of Apache raids. The isolation was absolute, the silence profound. It was the dogs that signaled the anomaly. They did not bark with the aggressive posturing reserved for coyotes or strangers. Instead, they emitted high-pitched yelps of primal fear, retreating beneath the floorboards. One of the women, drawn by the disturbance, approached the window. She peered out into the scrubland, expecting a war party or a mountain lion. Instead, she witnessed a biological impossibility. In the distance, moving with a silent, rolling gait that seemed to defy the physics of the rocky terrain, was a beast of immense proportions. It stood far taller than a horse, reddish in hue, with a neck that curved like a serpent. But it was the burden upon the beast that froze the blood in her veins. Strapped to the animal's back was a rider, a devilish-looking creature, limp and unresponsive, swaying grotesquely with the animal's movements. The woman, seized by a paralysis of fear, watched as the creature disappeared into the arroyo. She barricaded the door and waited in terror for the return of the men. When they arrived at dusk, they found a scene of inexplicable violence. The second woman, who had gone to the spring earlier that day, lay dead. She had been trampled, her body crushed into the mud of the creek bank. The evidence left in the earth was undeniable and baffling. Huge, cloven hoofprints, twice the size of a horse's, pressed deep into the clay. Clinging to the willow branches near the site were tufts of coarse red fur. The coroner from Solomonsville, summoned to the inquest, was a man of science and law, unprepared for the supernatural. He examined the battered body and the strange tracks. While he privately suspected foul play by human hands, the physical evidence, the massive prints, the red hair, the terrifying accounts, forced a verdict of death in some manner unknown. This event was the catalyst for a decade of terror. The Red Ghost ceased to be a solitary hallucination and became a regional nightmare. Reports began to trickle in from across the territory, from the Verde River to the mining camps of Clifton. Prospectors, sleeping under the stars, would wake to the sound of heavy breathing and snapping brush, only to see a monstrous shape vanishing into the moonlight. One account detailed a cowboy who, encountering the beast, attempted to lasso it. The animal, possessing supernatural strength, snapped the rope and nearly dragged the rider to his death. The descriptions became more detailed and more macabre. Witnesses spoke of a skeletal rider, bleached white by the sun, bound fast to the animal with rawhide straps that had cut deep into the beast's flesh. The Red Ghost was said to be unkillable, a phantom that could outrun the fastest Mustang and trample grizzly bears. It was a creature of pain and rage, wandering the desert with its grisly burden. But the Red Ghost was no specter. It was a feral remnant of a forgotten geopolitical ambition. It was the living debris of a grand experiment authorized by the United States Congress and championed by the future President of the Confederacy. The beast that terrorized Eagle Creek was a legacy of the 1850s, a time when American expansionists looked at the Great American Desert and decided that to conquer it, they must import the logistics of the Sahara. The footprints at Eagle Creek did not lead to the spirit world. They led back to the battlefields of the Mexican-American War, where the seed of this tragedy was planted in the mind of a Mississippi colonel named Jefferson Davis. To understand the Red Ghost, one must understand the logistical nightmare that birthed it. The acquisition of the American Southwest following the Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, presented the United States with a problem of continental magnitude. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had added over 500,000 square miles of territory, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, to the national domain. This was the Great American Desert. It was a landscape of waterless alkali plains, jagged volcanic rock, and searing heat that destroyed horses and mules. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. A journey that took days in the east took weeks in the west. The traditional equine infrastructure of the U.S. Army was failing. It was in this crucible of dust and distance that three men, a politician, a sailor, and a logistician, converged on a radical solution. Jefferson Davis is remembered primarily as the President of the Confederate States of America, but in the late 1840s and early 1850s, he was one of the most innovative and ambitious minds in the United States military establishment. A graduate of West Point, class of 1828, Davis had a storied, if occasionally undisciplined, cadet career. He famously risked expulsion for visiting the unauthorized Benny Havens Tavern, displaying a rebellious streak that would later define his political life. During the Mexican War, Davis commanded the 1st Mississippi Rifles, a volunteer regiment he drilled into an elite fighting force. At the Battle of Monterrey in 1846, Davis displayed cool heroism, leading his men into the teeth of Mexican fire at La Teneria. But it was at the Battle of Buena Vista where he became a national legend. Seeing a massive Mexican cavalry charge threatening to crush the American line, Davis ordered his men into a V formation. This tactical innovation created a deadly crossfire that shattered the enemy advance and saved the army of his father-in-law, General Zachary Taylor. However, Davis's experience in Mexico was not limited to glory. As an officer, he witnessed the logistical attrition of the campaign. He saw American horses wither under the northern Mexican sun. He saw mules die of thirst on long marches. He realized that the geography of the new frontier was fundamentally hostile to European livestock. If the United States, and specifically the South, was to expand its influence to the Pacific, it needed a transportation revolution. While Davis was commanding infantry in Mexico, Edward Fitzgerald Beale was fighting a different kind of war in California. Beale was a lieutenant in the United States Navy, but the fluidity of the conflict saw him serving on land with General Stephen W. Kearny's Army of the West. In December 1846, at the Battle of San Pascual, the American forces were decimated by Mexican lancers. The Americans were pinned down, surrounded, and starving. Beale, along with the legendary scout Kit Carson and an Indian guide, volunteered for a suicide mission. They needed to reach San Diego, 30 miles away, to call for reinforcements. The journey was a harrowing descent into the realities of the desert. To avoid detection, they abandoned their boots, crawling miles through cactus and sharp rocks barefoot. They went without water, hiding in crevices by day and moving by night. Beale survived the ordeal, but it broke his health for years. The experience seared into him a profound respect for the desert's lethality and a contempt for inadequate transport. He knew that the horse and the mule were not enough. Beale was a man of immense physical courage and curiosity. He would later carry the first samples of gold from California to the East Coast, triggering the 1849 gold rush. He was a connector of worlds, Navy and Army, East and West, and he became an ardent supporter of radical logistical experiments. If Davis provided the political will and Beale the practical grit, Major Henry C. Wayne provided the intellectual framework. An officer in the quartermaster department, Wayne had been introduced to the idea of camel transport by Major George H. Crossman as early as 1848. Crossman had proposed the idea in 1836 during the Seminole Wars, arguing that camels could traverse the Floridian swamps, but he was ignored. Wayne, however, took the idea and applied rigorous study to it. He researched the use of camels by the French in Algiers and the British in the Crimea. He studied their anatomy, their multi-chambered stomachs that stored water, their padded feet that expanded on sand, their ability to eat scrub brush. He became convinced that the camel was the only logical solution for the American Southwest. In 1848, Wayne submitted a detailed report to the War Department. It argued that the camel was unrivaled for strength and endurance, capable of carrying 700 to 900 pounds and traveling 30 to 40 miles a day without water. This report found its way to Senator Jefferson Davis, then chair of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. Davis, Wayne, and Beale represented a convergence of necessity. Davis, the visionary expansionist, needed a way to secure the vast new territories and potentially a route for a southern transcontinental railroad. Beale, the survivor, knew the terrain's unforgiving nature. Wayne, the scholar, had the data. For years, Davis fought a lonely battle in the Senate. In 1851 and 1852, he introduced amendments to appropriate funds for camel importation. He was met with ridicule. The mule lobby, powerful interests in Missouri and Kentucky who bred mules for the Army, saw the camel as an economic threat. Senators mocked the idea as a flight of fancy, laughing the proposal out of committee. But the tide turned in 1853. Franklin Pierce was elected president and appointed Jefferson Davis as his Secretary of War. Suddenly, the man who had been begging for the experiment was now the man in charge of the Army. Davis wasted no time. In his 1854 annual report, he officially recommended the appropriation, framing it not as a biological curiosity but as a military necessity for expresses and reconnaissances. The stage was set. The players were in position. The vast, empty map of the Southwest lay open, waiting for a new kind of footprint. But back in Arizona, 30 years in the future, the red ghost was still screaming in the night, a monstrous echo of the decision that was about to be made in Washington. The legislative deadlock finally broke on March 3, 1855. Aided by Senator James Shields of Illinois, who championed the amendment in the Senate, Secretary Davis secured an appropriation of $30,000 to be expended under the direction of the War Department in the purchase and importation of camels and dromedaries to be employed for military purposes. The laughingstock proposal had become federal law. Davis immediately activated his plan. He appointed Major Henry C. Wayne to command the expedition, tasking him with the scientific and acquisition aspects. For the maritime transport, the Navy detailed the USS Supply, a storeship commanded by Lieutenant David Dixon Porter. Porter, a member of a naval dynasty and a future Civil War admiral, approached the mission with characteristic thoroughness. He modified the USS Supply extensively, building a specialized camel deck equipped with ventilation hatches, stable stalls, and a camel car for loading the animals. He drafted strict regulations: no open lights, meticulous recording of feed consumption, and mandatory grooming. The USS Supply sailed from New York in June 1855, embarking on a bizarre odyssey that would take American sailors into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Major Wayne traveled separately to London and Paris to consult with zoologists and military experts, meeting Porter in La Spezia, Italy, in July. Their first port of call for acquisition was Tunis in August 1855. Here they purchased their first camel, a make-you-learn beast intended to teach the crew the basics of camel husbandry. The Bey of Tunis, intrigued by the American mission, gifted them 2 additional camels. However, the Americans quickly learned the perils of the trade. 2 of these animals were infected with the itch, a virulent form of mange that required constant treatment and threatened to infect the ship. From Tunis, the expedition sailed to Constantinople and the Crimea, observing British camel operations in the war against Russia. They then proceeded to Egypt, where they encountered diplomatic friction. The Viceroy of Egypt had banned the export of camels. It took weeks of negotiation and the strategic gifting of 2 Model 1855 rifles to secure an export permit. The viceroy, wishing to show favor, offered 6 of his finest camels as a gift. When the animals arrived, Porter was incensed to find they were diseased street camels, unfit for service. He refused them, forcing the viceroy's embarrassed staff to replace them with superior stock. The expedition concluded its shopping spree in Smyrna, modern Izmir, Turkey, in early 1856. Here, aided by Gwyn Harris Heap, Porter's brother-in-law and a Levant expert, they purchased the bulk of the herd. The acquisitions included swift dromedaries for riding and massive Bactrians for heavy transport. One acquisition became legendary. A Bactrian male standing 7 feet 4 inches tall and weighing over 2,000 pounds. The animal was so enormous that Porter had to order the ship's carpenters to cut away a section of the upper deck to accommodate its hump. The USS Supply was now a floating menagerie, carrying 33 camels and a team of native handlers. The return journey in the winter of 1856 was a nautical test of endurance. Porter's rules and regulations of the camel deck were tested by Atlantic gales. The camels, surprisingly, proved to be excellent sailors. When the ship rolled, the camels were strapped into a kneeling position to prevent injury. During the voyage, the herd grew. One of the female camels, purchased while pregnant, gave birth at sea. The calf, born under the stars and stripes in the middle of the Atlantic, was affectionately named Uncle Sam by the crew. The sailors, initially repulsed by the animal's pungent odor and tendency to regurgitate cud when agitated, began to develop a fondness for their strange cargo. On May 14, 1856, the USS Supply dropped anchor at Indianola, Texas. The unloading was a spectacle that drew crowds from miles around. The camels, sensing solid ground, became visibly excited. When hoisted onto the dock, they did not collapse from the voyage. Instead, they reared, kicked, and stampeded in joy, terrifying the local mules and horses. Major Wayne wrote to Davis with satisfaction. The camels had arrived in better condition than they had embarked. The first phase of the great experiment was complete. Now, they had to survive Texas. With the animals safely landed, the Army established a permanent base for the Camel Corps at Camp Verde, located in the Texas Hill Country near Bandera Pass. Major Wayne, respecting the animals' needs, constructed a khan, a traditional Middle Eastern camel corral with high stone walls, to house them. This structure, whose ruins still stand, was an architectural anomaly in the American West. The arrival of the camels ignited a cultural war within the Army's logistical branch. The Mule Lobby, the entrenched network of breeders and teamsters, launched a campaign of sabotage and ridicule. They viewed the camels as an existential threat to their livelihood. The soldiers assigned to the Camel Corps were equally skeptical. They hated the camel's smell, which they claimed was worse than that of a mule. They hated the way the camels spat a large, gelatinous, foul-smelling mass of cud when angry. They despised the animal's haughty demeanor. Unlike the stubborn mule, which could be whipped into submission, the camel responded to mistreatment with passive resistance or sudden, violent retaliation. To bridge this cultural gap, the Army relied on the native handlers brought over on the USS Supply. The most famous of these was Haji Ali, a man of Syrian and Greek parentage. The American soldiers, unable to pronounce his name, called him Hi Jolly. He became the soul of the Corps, teaching the soldiers how to pack the specialized saddles and interpreting the animals' moods. Another handler, George Caralambo, known as Greek George, also became a fixture of the frontier. Jefferson Davis knew that anecdotal evidence would not silence the critics in Washington. He needed hard data. In 1856, Major Wayne staged a definitive test, a direct competition between the camels and the Army's best mules. The test involved a supply run from Camp Verde to San Antonio, a distance of roughly 60 miles. 2 wagons, each pulled by a team of 6 mules, were pitted against a caravan of 6 camels. The mules pulled wagons loaded with 1,800 pounds of oats. The camels carried their loads directly on their backs. The results were devastating for the mule lobby. The camels carried heavier loads. Some reports suggest nearly double the weight per animal compared to the mule's distributed load, and completed the trip in 2.5 days. The mule teams took nearly 5 days. Furthermore, the camels arrived fresh, having foraged on the scrub brush along the trail, while the mules arrived exhausted and required grain rations carried in the wagons. Wayne's report was unequivocal. For strength in carrying burdens, for patient endurance of labor, the camel and dromedary are unrivaled. Emboldened by this success, Davis ordered a second expedition. In 1857, Lieutenant Porter returned to the Mediterranean and brought back another 41 camels, bringing the herd to over 70 animals. The experiment was no longer a theory. It was an operational reality. But to prove their worth to the nation, the camels would have to leave the Texas Hill Country and face the true test, the transcontinental crossing. In 1857, with Jefferson Davis having returned to the Senate, the new Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, authorized the supreme test of the Camel Corps. The mission was to survey a wagon road along the 35th parallel from Fort Defiance, New Mexico, to the Colorado River, a route that would eventually become the legendary Route 66 and later Interstate 40. Command of this expedition was given to Edward Fitzgerald Beale. Beale, the veteran of the San Pasqual disaster, was eager to vindicate his belief in the camel. He selected 25 of the best beasts from Camp Verde to accompany his survey party. The expedition set out in the late summer of 1857. Accompanying Beale was May Humphreys Stacy, a young man whose journal provides a vivid daily account of the trek. On June 21st, Stacy recorded the arrival of the camels at the staging area in San Antonio. The first intimation we had of their approach was the jingling of the large bells. Presently, 1, then 2, 3, 4. Who could have thought, 100 years ago, that now camels would be used on this continent as beasts of burden? As the expedition moved into the high desert of New Mexico and Arizona, the terrain became punishing. They traversed sharp volcanic rock that shredded the hooves of the mules and horses. The camels, with their soft, expanding footpads, walked over the razor-sharp stones without injury. Their dietary habits proved to be a logistical miracle. The American desert is filled with greasewood, creosote bush, a resinous plant that horses and mules refuse to eat. The camels devoured it. They also ate prickly pear cactus, thorns and all, deriving moisture from the succulent pads. Beale noted in his report, "They pack water for others for days under a hot sun and never get a drop. They pack corn and oats for months and never get a grain. And on the bitter greasewood and other worthless shrubs not only subsist, but keep fat." The ultimate test came in October 1857 when the expedition reached the Colorado River. The river was wide, the current swift and treacherous. The prevailing wisdom among the soldiers, and even some handlers, was that camels could not swim. It was believed their anatomy would cause them to float helplessly on their sides or drown. Beale faced a crisis. Ferrying the massive animals on rafts would be dangerous and time-consuming. He decided to gamble. He ordered the largest camel to be led to the water's edge. Hi Jolly, whispering to the beast, coaxed it into the current. To the astonishment of the watching troops, the camel plunged in and swam boldly across the rapidly flowing river, fully loaded. The rest of the herd followed. Not a single camel was lost. In stark contrast, 2 horses and 10 mules drowned in the attempt to cross the same waters. Beale wrote to Secretary Floyd with absolute conviction, "I have subjected them to trials which no other animal could possibly have endured. I believe at this time I may speak for every man in our party when I say that there is not one of them who would not prefer the most indifferent of our camels to 4 of our best mules." The Camel Corps had successfully traversed the continent. They had proven every theoretical argument made by Davis and Wayne. They were the superior transport for the American West. The survey was a triumph. Despite the overwhelming success of the Beale expedition, the Camel Corps was doomed by a force greater than the desert, the disintegration of the United States. In 1861, the political fabric of the nation tore apart. Texas seceded from the Union. On February 16, 1861, General David Twiggs, the Union commander of the Department of Texas, surrendered all federal property to the state forces under Confederate Colonel Ben McCulloch. This surrender included Camp Verde and its herd of camels. The Texas camel experiment was now a Confederate asset. However, the Confederates, pressed by the urgencies of war and lacking the specialized knowledge of handlers like Wayne, who had resigned to join the Confederacy but was assigned elsewhere, had little use for the beasts. The camels were misused. They were relegated to hauling salt and carrying mail around San Antonio. The soldiers, despising them as Jeff Davis's folly, mistreated them. Eventually, many were turned loose into the desert to fend for themselves or sold to circuses and private owners. At Fort Tejon in California, the camels from Beale's expedition faced a similar fate. With the government focused on the war, the experiment was abandoned. The animals were transferred to the Los Angeles Quartermaster Depot and sold at auction. The U.S. brand on their shoulders, once a mark of federal property, became a scar of abandonment. It was from this chaotic dispersal that the legends of the Southwest were born. The camels did not die. They adapted. They roamed the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, thriving on the terrain they were built to conquer. This brings us back to the horror at Eagle Creek. The Red Ghost was almost certainly a feral camel, likely one of the original Army stock or a descendant. The devilish rider was revealed in 1893, 10 years after the first sightings when a rancher named Mizu Hastings shot the beast in his turnip patch. When Hastings examined the corpse, he found the animal covered in scars from heavy rawhide straps. The rider was gone, the bones likely shaken loose over a decade of wandering. But the knots remained, binding the legend to the reality. The prevailing theory is that the rider was a corpse, perhaps a soldier or a prospector, tied to the animal as a macabre joke or a desperate measure that went wrong. The animal, driven mad by the burden and the straps, had become a killer. The legacy of the Camel Corps lingered into the 20th century. Douglas MacArthur, the future general of the Army, lived as a boy at Fort Selden, New Mexico, in the 1880s. He recalled seeing one of the old Army camels wandering the grounds, a living relic of the pre-war frontier. The human face of the experiment, High Jolly, remained in the West. He scouted for the Army, prospected for gold, and eventually married Gertrudis Cerna in Tucson in 1880, adopting the name Philip Tedrow. He died in 1902 in Quartzsite, Arizona, penniless but beloved. Today, a pyramid-shaped monument marks his grave, topped with a copper camel, a permanent tribute to the strange history he embodied. The U.S. Army Camel Corps was a scientific success but a historical failure. The data proved that camels were the superior logistical solution for the American West. Had the Civil War not intervened, or had the Transcontinental Railroad not arrived in 1869, the camel might have become a permanent fixture of the American landscape. Instead, they became ghosts. They were victims of timing, abandoned in the schism between North and South, and erased by the steam engine. Yet, for those who know where to look, at the grave in Quartzsite, the ruins of the Khan at Camp Verde, or the old newspaper reports of a red beast in the Arizona moonlight, the footprint of the camel remains, deep and indelible in the history of the American frontier.